Hey, this is Matt Ting from Peak Frameworks, and today we are going to look at the private equity placement of the top elite boutiques in the world, answering the question, which elite boutique places the best? In this video, we're only going to be looking at elite boutiques, which are investment banking firms that specifically focus on investment banking and advisory, unlike bulge brackets, which focus on a broad range of corporate finance solutions. So we won't be including firms like Goldman or Morgan Stanley. Now, to set the stage a little bit, from my experience, elite boutiques tend to have a wider variance in terms of culture when you look at different elite boutiques. It seems like a lot of bulge brackets tend to gravitate towards the same kind of corporate facelessness that you get at a lot of big financial institutions, whereas at a lot of elite boutiques, you still have the founder or key people of the founding team involved with the operations, and these firms tend to be quite a bit smaller, so MDs can have a larger influence on what the culture is like, as well as what your personal working experience is. And I point this out because I do think that personality, as well as difference in corporate strategy, is a little bit more evident at these elite boutiques. Now, today we're going to be talking about private equity, and if you'd like to optimize your own chances for private equity recruiting, you should definitely check out the course on our website at peakframeworks.com. So when we ran the numbers on placement, a couple of elite boutiques stood out above all of the rest of them, and that would be Lazard, Evercore, Moelis, and Centerview. And I would actually say these four firms are the ones that most consistently place at the top of elite boutique and independent advisory league tables. Now, the notable exclusion here, I would say, is PJT, which spun out of Blackstone, and I think they are a phenomenal firm, but they are quite new. They've only been around since 2015. So the numbers for a study like this, which favors volume, is going to be significantly lower. And I want to point out that each of these firms has a slightly different kind of identity and experience when you do work at them. Lazard, for example, I would describe as a classic elite boutique. They are the ones who popularized the independent advisory firm. They're much older than these other firms, and a lot of their presence is based in Europe. Evercore is a firm that I worked at. I think they really push this idea of having a collegial culture. They care a lot about their junior program, as well as having a strong internship class. And when I was there was definitely a culture of senior people trying to help their juniors with buy-side recruiting. We're also going to talk about Moelis, which is reputed for being a very hardworking firm, and it's probably the firm where you get the most face time with the actual founder of the company. Ken Moelis is still active in operations and still is involved with the deal making at the company. And fourth, we're going to talk about Centerview. They are reputed for being a highly intellectual firm. They're also known as the investment bank that pays the most on the street, and their analyst terms on average are longer than at other firms, typically 3 years as opposed to 2 years at most of these other investment banks. I'll also note that my professional work experience is all in the United States, and that is going to temper how I interpret some of this data. Now, for this exercise, I'm going to use the services of List Alpha, and they actually reached out to me after they saw me painstakingly scrape my own data for private equity firms. But List Alpha is a people intelligence platform that scrapes LinkedIn, and it essentially collected all of these private equity profiles and helped me look into the data itself. So if you want to learn more about List Alpha or see their blog post on this topic, you can check the link in the description. So now let's get to the actual methodology. For this study, we looked at the very largest private equity firms in the world, which we previously identified in this video and this blog post, and we are looking at data on a global basis. So it's important to remember that this is only for large cap private equity, so the trends here might not apply to the middle market level or to other investing strategies. So now let's take a look at this summary graph, which has the number of people in private equity that came from one of these investment banks, as well as the percentage per capita for each of these firms. And I'll note that this number is based on total number of employees. It's not just investment banking analysts, but I think it directionally shows you what the data is saying. So I won't hide my surprise. When I saw this data, I was a little shocked, but it does seem empirically that Lazard has the most number of people in private equity on a global basis. I think the main contributor to this is because of their global rankings. When you look at Europe M&A, when you look at the Europe private equity scene, Lazard is so much more dominant than every other elite boutique. Honestly, the investment banking landscape in the United States is so different from that of Europe, and it does explain why these rankings might be a little unintuitive if you worked in the United States. Now, another important factor here is magnitude. These firms aren't all the same size, and on a per capita basis, it actually appears that Moelis is the best investment bank for recruiting. And Evercore seems to split the difference on these metrics. They have a higher percentage per capita than Lazard, and they have a higher magnitude overall than Moelis. Now, what's interesting here is Centerview. Centerview's numbers are quite a bit lower than the other firms, and honestly, this isn't a strike against the firm. I actually think the implication here is that so many people prefer to stay in investment banking if they can work at Centerview. If you look purely on a financial basis, it can make a lot of sense to stay at a firm like Centerview. In fact, I've seen people go from private equity to Centerview just because of the opportunity there. Centerview is also much more US centric than these other firms and quite a bit smaller, so it does make sense that their numbers don't stack up on a global basis. I would actually go so far to say that Lazard is the only elite boutique that's both dominant in North America as well as Europe. If you look at the league tables, Evercore, Centerview, and Moelis honestly don't perform quite as well in Europe. Over there, firms like Perella Weinberg and Rothschild actually arguably have a stronger presence. Now, just for the sake of transparency, let's look at the actual cut on a firm-by-firm basis, and I will note that this screen was done at the end of 2021. I think you can observe pretty good coverage from Lazard, Evercore, and Moelis at all of the top private equity firms. I think the one interesting point here is if you look at European-based private equity firms, you can really see Lazard's further dominance. If you look at EQT, Primera, CVC, and Apax, which are the European private equity firms here, Lazard places more people into these firms than the rest of the boutiques combined, and I think that really just underscores the dominance of Lazard in this region. So I think if you're starting your career in Europe, Lazard seems like far and away the best elite boutique to be at on this metric. So honestly, that information didn't fully stack up to my own preconceptions and my personal biases for private equity recruiting. I honestly chose Evercore over other firms because I thought they had the best buy-side recruiting among investment banks, so I asked List Alpha to do a cut of this only for US offices. Now, if we look at the data this way, Lazard is actually still number one, but it's quite a bit closer with Evercore. I would argue that they're tied for first. You can also see that Lazard and Evercore have more than double the placements of a firm like Moelis and more than that compared to Centerview. And if you compare to the global data, virtually all of Centerview's placements in private equity are in the US. Now, one observation I think is interesting is that some private equity firms seem to disproportionately hire from some investment banks. Blackstone and Warburg hire a ton of people from Evercore, and that was true when I was there as well. Brookfield and Ares hired disproportionately from Lazard, and I think that just shows you that there are certain relationships or at least recruiting patterns at different firms. And it's also worth noting that European private equity firms don't seem to favor Lazard when it comes to the US offices. Now, the last cut I wanted to look at is junior roles only in the United States, so only looking at associates and senior associates. And the logic here is that this would best apply to what the current recruiting dynamics are. The issue, if you look at all roles and include senior roles, is that that would include people who recruited up to 2 decades ago, in which case the dynamics were very different and the pattern was very different, but the result here was quite similar. Evercore and Lazard are tied for first, and Moelis and Centerview are in similar positions. It's also worth noting that Moelis is third, but they honestly place quite similarly on a per capita basis, and I would say in general you can really end up at any of these firms and you'll have one of the highest chances of breaking into private equity. Even at Centerview, honestly I think the odds are quite good. I just think that they have a culture more of staying in investment banking and becoming a lifer banker as opposed to leaving to the buy side. So I know this was pretty nerdy, but I hope it was a fun exercise for you to watch through. And honestly, I have to say, all of these investment banks are a great place to start your career. So hopefully this was interesting, and I will see you in the next video.